Ben Affleck sat in his car outside the bustling city shelter, the familiar hum of Los Angeles echoing through the streets. The evening sky was painted with streaks of purple and orange, the kind of sunset that always made him think of how much he wished for simplicity, far away from the flashing cameras and constant scrutiny of the public. For years, Ben had felt suffocated by the weight of fame. It had come with success, recognition, and luxuries, but it had also carried a distance from the real world, a reality where people struggled just to survive. Fame was easy to run from, but the truth about homelessness, the destitution that plagued so many lives, was impossible to ignore. Ben remembered a time, years ago in Boston, when he had been walking with his mother and saw a man huddled in a blanket on a cold winter night. He was just a boy then, too young to fully comprehend the depths of what that man's life must have been like. But he understood one thing: people like him, people on the streets, weren't supposed to be invisible. The man's eyes met his, and for just a second, he saw something more than just a homeless person. He saw a person like him, someone who had dreams, had been loved, had lived a life that once had hope. Ben had never forgotten that moment. Now, years later, Ben had come full circle, back to where the real work could be done. It wasn't on a movie set. It wasn't in front of the cameras. It was here, in the shelters, the forgotten corners of the city where people needed more than just a handout. They needed respect. They needed dignity. They needed someone to believe in them. That was why he had quietly started helping away from the spotlight. No fanfare, no press conferences, just action. Every Wednesday and Thursday, Ben would leave his house early in the morning and drive across the city to volunteer. At first, it had been small, just donating to shelters, helping organize food drives, cleaning up the streets. But soon he felt compelled to do more. He spoke with people who had been homeless for years, each person with a different story, yet the same struggle. Some were veterans, others were mothers trying to protect their children, and many were caught in a cycle of addiction and mental illness. Ben realized that homelessness was not just about poverty. It was about systemic failures, about people who had been forgotten. And that was what drove him to be part of the solution. But he didn't want anyone to know. The last thing Ben wanted was to appear as if he was doing it for self-glorification. So, he worked behind the scenes, donating anonymously and using his connections to create resources for those who needed them the most. No cameras, no interviews, no social media hashtags, just genuine effort. He'd seen enough of Hollywood to know that most people only cared when the cameras were rolling. But here, in the shelters and on the streets, he could make a difference without needing the recognition. It wasn't long before he became close to some of the individuals he helped. One of them was Ray, a former teacher who had fallen on hard times after a tragic accident left him unable to work. Ray had a sharp mind, a love for literature, and a quiet humility that made him stand out from others at the shelter. Ben would often sit with him for hours, talking about books, life, and the misfortunes that had led Ray here. Ben learned about the depth of Ray's grief and his ongoing battle with addiction. But what struck Ben most was the way Ray never blamed anyone else. Ray accepted his situation with a quiet resignation, but also a quiet hope. A hope that he could one day rebuild his life. One evening, after a particularly tough day of volunteering, Ben sat beside Ray on a worn-out bench in the shelter's courtyard. The cool night air had a comforting weight to it. Ray shared his dream of becoming a teacher again, of helping young people understand the world through literature. Ben listened intently, moved by the simplicity of Ray's desire. It was a goal that many people in Ray's position wouldn't even dare to dream. For the first time in his life, Ben felt a deep connection to another person, someone who had faced adversity and yet still saw beauty in the world. "Ray, you'll get there," Ben said quietly. "I believe in you." And it was in that moment that Ben realized the true value of his work. It wasn't just about charity. It was about restoring dignity. Helping someone like Ray regain a sense of purpose was more important than any award or headline he could ever receive. Ben started to spend more time outside the shelter, connecting with others in the homeless community. He went to local schools and talked about homelessness, encouraging young people to volunteer and get involved. The ripple effect of his efforts began to grow. Ben knew that change would take time, but he also understood that his role in all of this wasn't to take credit, but to guide the way for others to follow. Ben's quiet work didn't go unnoticed for long. Word began to spread about his involvement with the homeless community. But it wasn't the way most people would expect. Rather than a big reveal or a press tour, Ben's story was shared by those he had helped, the people who had witnessed his dedication firsthand. They spoke about the actor who had come to their aid, who had quietly donated money to help them get back on their feet, who had treated them with respect when others had ignored them. Despite the growing awareness, Ben remained elusive, never seeking the spotlight. His anonymity became his trademark, a reminder that real heroes didn't need recognition. But even so, the people he helped began to tell their stories. Ray found a job at a local community center teaching literacy programs to children. Lena, the single mother he had befriended, managed to secure stable housing after Ben helped her navigate the complicated bureaucracy of city housing programs. Johnny, the former construction worker, found a job with a local construction company and began to rebuild his life, slowly but surely. These were the real success stories. Stories that were not about Ben Affleck, but about the people who had the strength to rise above their circumstances with a little help from someone who believed in them. As time passed, Ben's quiet influence continued to grow. He used his wealth and connections to help fund affordable housing projects and mental health initiatives for homeless individuals. His foundation, though small and modest, began to take shape. What had started as one man's effort to make a difference had turned into a movement, with more and more people joining in to tackle the issue of homelessness. Ben knew there was still so much more to do, but he was no longer focused on changing the world overnight. He understood that true, lasting change happened in small, everyday moments. The quiet acts of kindness, the restoration of dignity, the empowerment of people who had been forgotten by society. And as he watched the people he had helped thrive, he realized that his own life had changed as well. He was no longer just a Hollywood actor. He was a man who had found his purpose in the real world, in the faces of those who needed him most. Years later, Ben stood before a crowd at the opening of a new shelter that bore his foundation's name. He had been invited to speak, but instead of a grand speech, he simply told the story of Ray, Lena, and Johnny, three individuals whose lives had been transformed with the right support. He shared their stories, their successes, and their struggles. And when he was done, he quietly stepped back, allowing the applause to wash over him, though he knew it wasn't for him. It was for them, the true heroes, the ones who had shown that with hope, hard work, and dignity, anyone could overcome the odds.